A husband discovered his wife's betrayal and carefully devised an elaborate revenge, delivering a lethal surprise to her lover. The sky was enveloped in an intense darkness, rendering visibility almost impossible. Upon receiving the signal, 2 muffled shots rang out, bringing down 2 guards. The gunfire continued for another 15 minutes until a calm silence returned. Over the radio came the message, "Building cleared, ready for evacuation." 14 years later, I found myself standing by a hotel window, watching the sun sink below the horizon, reflecting on how everything had started and how I ended up in that place. I took a sip of vodka, feeling the burn as I swallowed, mirroring the memories of recent weeks. Despite the pain, I held on to a small hope that all was not entirely lost. 6 weeks before, I had stumbled upon a painful discovery: my wife of 12 years was having an affair. I came across this knowledge accidentally. Isn't that how most unsuspecting husbands find out? Let me introduce myself. I'm Logan. I met Jamie in our junior year of college, and we stayed together until graduation. Afterward, I joined the Marine Corps while she embarked on her career search. At that time, I loved her deeply, yet I didn't want her to marry me only to be stuck waiting while I was stationed in unknown places, which seemed unfair to her. 5 years later, when I finished my military service, I returned home and soon landed a good position in the sales department of a large company. My boss, a former Marine, had a particular preference for hiring veterans due to our discipline and work ethic. I excelled in my role and soon decided to try dating again, exploring online options. To my surprise, I found Jamie looking radiant in her profile pictures. She may not have the typical appearance of a supermodel, but Jamie has an athletic, dancer's body built from years of modern dance in college. Standing at 5'8", she has a fit, curvaceous figure with long, thick brown hair, deep brown eyes, and a smile that always warms my heart. Excited, I signed up quickly and reached out to her. It wasn't until a week later that she responded, asking angrily where I had been and why I hadn't contacted her for the past 5 years. If she was that upset, I figured she must have missed me, which seemed promising. Before long, we were dating again, almost seamlessly picking up where we had left off in college. Within a year, we were married, and a year after that, our first child, Rebecca, was born. My career was progressing smoothly, although my job now required me to travel more, as expected. 2 years later, we welcomed our second daughter, Amy. By then, I had been promoted, and we had moved into a lovely home in a neighborhood with great schools. My position demanded frequent travel, sometimes up to 2 weeks each month. Only years later did Jamie begin to express concerns, asking when I might reduce my travel, saying she missed me and felt safer when I was around. I reassured her that a promotion would soon allow me to travel less, letting me be home more often. Though she accepted this, it was clear she wasn't happy to see me leaving again. Reflecting back, I now realized there were warning signs I missed. I was entirely in love with Jamie, and this trust blinded me to potential issues. The first hint appeared when we began arguing over trivial things upon my return. She would say things like, "If you were here more, this wouldn't happen, or we need you here," not running across the country. She had valid points, although it took time for me to see that. Then, I noticed unfamiliar lingerie while looking for a shirt. Jamie generally prefers simple sleepwear, like a t-shirt and shorts or sweatpants, and the lingerie silk set was unlike her usual choices. I assumed she had simply bought it for herself. The next indication was a decrease in our intimacy. Once full of passion, our time together had dwindled, with Jamie offering excuses like being tired or not in the mood. At first I thought this phase was temporary and believed things would normalize when I traveled less. I refrained from pushing the matter, aware that pressing her would only make things worse. The final blow was especially devastating. A close friend saw Jamie with someone at a farmer's market, about 40 miles from our home. A friend initially mistook me for someone else as he observed a couple holding hands, laughing, touching, and kissing. When he got closer, he realized it wasn't me. Suspecting something unusual, he quietly backed off, trailing them for a while until they drove away. I vividly recall receiving his call. My phone buzzed just as I was leaving a meeting, and Frank called, saying he had something important to discuss. I explained that I was between meetings and couldn't talk, suggesting we speak later. Frank agreed but urged me to call back as soon as possible, his voice tinged with worry. I assured him I would, asking if it was urgent. He replied that it could wait, so I ended the call, thinking it must not be serious. Later that evening, I returned his call and asked why he'd called, curious about the urgency. Frank hesitated before revealing that he'd seen my wife with another man earlier that day. Nervously, I asked if she was just with a friend, feeling uneasy. Struggling to find the words, Frank finally explained they looked like a couple, holding hands, laughing and kissing. Apologizing for being the one to tell me, he suggested my wife might be having an affair. Hearing this left me stunned. I couldn't understand why he thought that. After all, we were happily married, and she had no reason to betray me, or so I believed. Suddenly, the subtle clues I had previously ignored began to make sense, though I still found it hard to accept. Frank reminded me that, difficult as it was, I needed to know. He suggested there might still be hope for saving my marriage and offered his support, saying to reach out if I needed anything. I thanked him, hung up, and sat on the bed, grappling with the harsh reality, unsure if it was some cruel joke. My anger grew at the thought of my wife's betrayal. During my flight home, I began to cool down and carefully consider my next steps, aware that without concrete proof I was at a loss for how to proceed. Upon landing, I immediately called Frank to ask about the man she was seen with, determined to protect my daughters from our issues and try to save my marriage. Frank advised me against doing anything rash and mentioned a friend who had faced a similar situation. He suggested I speak with his friend for advice on handling this delicate matter, emphasizing the importance of avoiding actions I'd regret. Frank's advice struck a chord, and I realized guidance was essential. Right now, the best approach was to go home and act normal, as any suspicion on her part would make gathering evidence harder. Frank assured me he wasn't mistaken about what he'd seen, though he hoped he was wrong. When I got home, I composed myself to act naturally around Jamie and the girls. It was challenging, but I managed to pull it off. In the following days, I searched the house for any sign of an affair, but nothing stood out, though a nagging feeling persisted that I was missing something. Frank later suggested meeting his friend. I agreed, saying I'd meet them at a bar across town the next evening after work, explaining my lateness to Jamie as a work commitment. In the quiet, dim bar, I found Frank and his friend Mark seated in a corner booth. They were nursing beers, and Frank looked up as I joined them. Mark, introduced as Frank's friend, greeted me with sympathy. Though none of us seemed thrilled to be there, Mark understood my situation, having been informed by Frank. He expressed empathy but cautioned against making the same mistakes he'd made, sharing how his quest for revenge had led to a 5-year prison sentence and losing everything in the subsequent divorce and legal battles against his wife and her lover. Mark warned me not to act recklessly, his gaze firm as he advised me. I acknowledged his advice, curious about less destructive approaches. Mark admitted he would still confront the lover, but in a more strategic way to catch him off guard. His disdain for the man who had interfered in his marriage was evident. He went on to say that, looking back, he would have chosen divorce. Our conversation then shifted to a strategic breakdown of my options. First, gathering undeniable evidence of my wife's infidelity was crucial to prevent denial. Next, consulting a divorce lawyer would help me understand my rights and protect my assets. Third, keeping a cash reserve was essential if she discovered my actions and froze our accounts. Finally, securing a temporary apartment or other accommodation would ensure I had a place to stay if I decided to leave. Although these suggestions were logical, I initially felt that a frank conversation might resolve everything. When I mentioned this, Mark's response was firm as he pounded his fist on the table. He stressed the importance of avoiding foolish actions, suggesting her lover might have fed her lies. He advised that, before confronting my wife, I needed to understand what she believed and what had been said. Drawing on my military background as a Marine, Mark underscored the value of reliable information in any conflict, emphasizing the need for a clear plan and strategy in case things took an unexpected turn. His mention of my military service surprised me, and I confirmed I was indeed a Marine. He explained that careful planning was just as vital here. I sighed, struggling to accept the possibility that my once happy marriage might end like this. Mark offered a quiet apology, and we sat silently until Frank finally broke the silence, asking what I planned to do next. I realized I needed a concrete plan and expressed my hope to save my marriage if possible, though I also wanted the other man to face consequences without risking my freedom. I mentioned my intent to gather evidence and details on my adversary, which brought a smile to Mark's face. He cautioned against hiring a private investigator, sharing his own costly and unfruitful experience with one. With access to her bank, credit card statements, and phone records, he advised I watch for any unusual purchases or calls. He also suggested considering the possibility of a second phone and setting up hidden cameras around the house for video and audio recording. Though it was uncomfortable, I agreed, intent on making him pay. Our discussion went on for another hour as I mentally recorded each suggestion. Mark's advice stressed the importance of not discussing this situation at work until I identified my wife's potential lover, mindful that someone could pick up on my schedule. He also mentioned he would have approached his wife's lover with more subtlety, which motivated me to create a plan to outsmart him. However, I needed additional information and support. The next workday, I carefully reviewed my travel schedule for the month, spotting an upcoming 2-day trip. Worried about people at work being aware of my plans, I quietly spoke with my boss and suggested extending the client visit to a full week. He approved without hesitation. My next step was to create an impression that I'd be gone while secretly returning. Using cash with a prepaid debit card, I booked a return flight on another airline. Additionally, I purchased multiple spy cameras and a camera with powerful zoom and low light capability. This marked the beginning of my strategy to identify the individual involved. The second part of the plan was to record them in action, removing any doubt about her unfaithfulness. The day was consumed with careful planning, a skill I excel at. However, the main detail that remained unknown was the man's identity. Until that was resolved, I couldn't trust anyone, not even my closest friend and boss, Hal. Recognizing that discovering the name could take time, I stayed committed. By the end of the week, all the items I'd ordered had been delivered to Frank's home. Now, all that was left was finding an opportunity to discreetly install the spy cameras in my house. With Jamie's Saturday routine of shopping with our daughters and her mother, the house would be empty. Within hours, I had installed and tested each camera, which I could monitor in real time from my tablet or laptop via the internet. With the cameras set up, I proceeded to search the house for additional clues. Starting with the credit card statements, I looked for any suspicious charges, followed by checking her closet for any new, revealing clothing. Although I didn't find definitive evidence, I did come across a short red dress I had never seen her wear before. The idea of her wearing it for anyone but me troubled me deeply. Though there wasn't concrete proof, seeing the dress drove me to the point of needing to clear my head, so I put on my running shorts and shoes and went for a jog. A long run usually helped calm my thoughts and gave me perspective. Arriving home, I saw Jamie's car in the driveway and knew my angels, as I call my daughters, were home. Their laughter as I entered the house always brought a smile to my face. I called out to Jamie and was soon greeted by my girls, who came running from the family room to share details of their day. Jamie emerged from the kitchen, asked about my run, and kissed me on the cheek before gently shooing the girls away so she could continue with dinner preparations. After enjoying a meal of pork chops, I took a shower and then helped put the girls to bed. Later, we watched TV in the family room, but my mind kept drifting to thoughts of Jamie's activities during my work trips. Overwhelmed, I announced an early bedtime and headed to our bedroom. Once there, I noticed Jamie's purse on the hope chest and seized the opportunity to search for clues. Inside, I discovered a cheap cell phone I hadn't known about. I turned it on, recorded the number, and checked the call log, finding only one unfamiliar number, which I saved before shutting the phone off. This undeniable evidence forced me to face the truth about her affair, leaving me heartbroken and filled with anger. Remembering Mark's advice to avoid acting impulsively, I resolved to be patient. I quickly changed and pretended to be asleep when Jamie finally joined me, avoiding conversation to keep my suspicions hidden. The next few days were difficult as I struggled to maintain normalcy, despite the undeniable proof of her betrayal. On the morning of another business trip, I followed my usual routine. Just before leaving, I casually asked Jamie if she had any special plans during my absence. She looked at me strangely before mentioning it would just be her usual routine. I quickly said goodbye and drove to the airport, hoping the cameras would reveal what happened at home. Although part of me hoped she would avoid disrespecting our home, I was beginning to accept that she might not. After completing my work with a client ahead of schedule, I packed my bags and prepared to return home that evening. Monitoring the video feeds, I saw nothing unusual, so I reviewed earlier footage. The system activated recording whenever someone entered a camera-equipped room, saving all videos centrally for remote access. As I fast-forwarded through the day's recordings, I found a clip of Jamie using her secret phone. I rewound to watch her answer the call and played it at normal speed. Although the audio quality was poor, I could still hear enough. She called the person baby, discussed my absence for the week, and arranged to meet discreetly at a motel. She laughed and turned away from the camera, making it impossible for me to catch the entire conversation. When she turned back, she continued, telling him to park at a coffee shop down the street a few blocks away. "All right, baby, I can't wait, I'll see you tomorrow night," she said. I was stunned. The thought of him entering my house and possibly my bed made me furious. Though I imagined ways to make him disappear, Mark's warning against rash decisions played in my mind, helping me suppress my anger. I resolved to wait for the right moment, even as the strain grew unbearable. On the flight back, the weight of Jamie's betrayal bore down on me. The woman I loved, the mother of our children, was involved with someone else. Why would she do this? What had driven her to be with another man? By the time I landed, I wasn't ready to face her, so I checked into a hotel, needing a quiet place to plan my next move. I knew that tonight was the night he would be at my house, and I wanted to see him there with my own eyes. Was he someone I already knew or a new face from work? That was crucial information I needed to help decide my next steps. Unsure what time he'd arrive, I knew he planned to park at the coffee shop down the street, so I waited there. Without knowing what he looked like, I rented a car at the airport and chose a parking spot with a clear view of the lot. Bringing along my camera, I checked the zoom quality it allowed me to capture close-ups of his face and license plate from at least 100 yards away. At around 9 p.m., a silver BMW M3 pulled into the lot. I began snapping photos, thankful for the good lighting that allowed me a clear look at his face. He was unfamiliar to me. Parking at the far end of the lot, away from the coffee shop, he then walked toward my house. Taking a deep breath to calm my anger, I used the coffee shop's Wi-Fi to access my home's cameras. After a few minutes, I watched him enter my house and passionately kiss my wife. Restraining my fury, I listened as he told her he'd thought of her all day, and they spoke about having the place to themselves until morning since she'd sent the kids to her parents for the night, and I wouldn't be back until Friday. How considerate of her to ensure the kids were away. I watched as he started undressing my wife right in our living room. She reciprocated, and within moments they were both unclothed, touching each other. She suggested they go up to the bedroom, and they ran out of the camera's view toward the stairs, laughing and leaving their clothes scattered on the floor. Realizing it was time to act, I quickly exited my car and headed to my house. The front door was conveniently unlocked since they'd hurried upstairs. I went directly to his pants, found his wallet, and noted everything I needed, plus a little extra. Taking the wallet, I went to my home office on the first floor, which was away from the bedroom, reducing the risk of being heard. I powered on my computer and printer scanner, waiting as they booted up. Once ready, I began copying items from Stephen Bannister's wallet, including his driver's license and other information. After putting the wallet back, I took pictures of their discarded clothes and started recording with the camera's video feature. Silently climbing the stairs, I reached the top, where faint sounds of their lovemaking turned my stomach. The bedroom door was wide open, and they assumed they were alone in the house. Slowly I approached the bedroom. Their voices grew louder as I stood in the doorway, observing Stephen lying on his back, unclothed, with my wife on top of him in a compromising position. They were so engrossed that I managed to step inside without notice. Knowing the hidden cameras didn't capture the best clarity, I wanted high-definition footage, so I recorded several minutes. Resisting the urge to grab a bat and confront him, Mark's advice echoed in my mind, warning against any rash actions. I slowly backed out and left the house, returning to the hotel. My thoughts were a chaotic mix, and my anger was overwhelming. This was the angriest I had ever felt, and it scared me. I called Frank, sharing what I'd done and the details I'd gathered. Frank acknowledged my actions but expressed concern about the risk of going back into the house. He offered his support and apologized for what I was going through. I thanked him, mentioning I needed someone to talk to, and that I'd ask Mark for a favor. Frank agreed to arrange a weekend meeting with Mark, as Mark had already offered to help. After the call with Frank, I tried to sleep but couldn't. I decided to work off my anger with a morning run, though it barely eased my frustration. Following the run, I took a shower and eventually managed to nap, compensating for the sleepless night. Later, I returned the rental car to the airport, picked up my own car, and went directly to the office to check in and speak with Hal. I needed to cut down on work travel, so after closing the door in Hal's office, I explained my situation, mentioning my wife's wish for me to be home more and the necessity of adjusting my schedule. Hal listened and then informed me that my promotion had been approved, meaning I wouldn't need to travel as frequently. Though a relief, I was too consumed by thoughts of my wife's affair to fully absorb it. Hal noticed my distraction and expressed concern about my recent behavior, prompting me to confide in him. I shared that I had caught my wife with another man and recorded evidence of them together. Hal reacted with shock and sympathy, offering his support. I explained my need to stay home to try saving my marriage and asked him to keep everything confidential, fearing someone at work might be involved in leaking my schedule. Hal agreed to cover for me if I needed time off to gather evidence. I told him my intent to confront her with solid proof, aiming either to salvage the marriage or protect myself in a divorce. Hal promised his discretion and support. After thanking him, I left his office with a slight sense of relief, feeling some things were falling into place, even though I knew my marriage might be irreparably broken. Returning home that night, I tried to act normal. My girls ran to greet me as I entered, and I struggled to keep from crying, thinking of how they'd be affected if we divorced. The idea of needing permission to see my own children was unbearable. I felt a deep resolve I had to get custody of my kids. On Saturday, while my wife and daughters were out shopping, I met with Mark and Frank at a diner. I updated them on my progress with gathering evidence. Mark admired my resolve and, somewhat surprised, commented that I hadn't taken more drastic action. He then asked how he could assist, noting Frank had mentioned my past in prison. Both Frank and Mark looked at me with curiosity, and for the next hour I laid out my plan and explained my intentions, hoping to leverage Mark's connections. As I finished, Mark smiled approvingly and expressed admiration for the plan. He mentioned that he knew someone who might help and suggested they could introduce us to others, though he warned they would likely expect payment. Mark agreed to reach out to his contacts and took my cell number, promising to call once he'd spoken with his friends so we could arrange a meeting to finalize the plan's details. After discussing a few additional ideas, I planned to start implementing them as soon as possible. The rest of the weekend passed as most weekends do, with one difference: Sunday night. My wife and I usually were intimate, but this time she wasn't feeling well. It wasn't the first time, so I wasn't surprised, but it had been over a month since we'd last been close. With another trip approaching, I asked Hal for the following week off, instructing that if anyone called, they should be told I was on a normal business trip. Hal readily agreed and wished me luck. Now I had to inform my wife about the longer trip. She wasn't happy, which was expected. I assured her that my frequent travels would soon end, and I'd be home more often. Trying to lift her mood, I joked that I'd be around so much she'd get tired of me. She didn't smile but instead sighed, asking me to call when I arrived. Her distant attitude left me with an unsettling sense that our marriage was nearing its end. Quickly leaving before I said something regrettable, I headed to the airport. My meetings with the clients went well, and we finalized a deal early, allowing me to fly back a day sooner. Throughout the week, I checked the cameras, but he didn't return to my house, although I did catch her on that hidden cell phone. Listening in, I realized this was the opportunity I'd been waiting for, even though what I overheard was shocking. Back at the office, I found my ordered items ready. Knowing my wife's usual schedule, I could set up one of these items without much risk of discovery. With her 4-day gym schedule and her spare car keys in my possession, I could place the item in a spot where she wouldn't find it. Next, I went to Stephen's condo to check if he was home. Seeing his car in the carport, I assumed he was inside. With my camera in hand, I looked for a clear view of him through the sliding doors and got lucky he was there, and he wasn't alone. Another woman was with him, and they seemed romantically involved, kissing and touching each other like a couple. This was too good an opportunity to miss, so I recorded a video of their interaction. When they left together, I followed at a safe distance. They went to lunch, providing me the perfect chance to plant the second device on his car. This part was trickier and riskier, but I managed to do it undetected. Now, all that remained was to wait, which was the hardest part. Soon after, I received a call from Mark, who informed me that he'd found a friend willing to assist with my plan. We agreed to meet in my hotel room to keep things private, given the nature of our plans. When they arrived, Mark introduced me to Joe, a computer hacker who could help us. Over the next hour, I shared the details of my wife's affair and my desire for revenge against her lover. I showed them the copies of the contents of the man's wallet that I'd taken. Joe voiced concerns about the legality of our plan and asked what he'd gain from helping. After considering, I offered him $5,000 cash, and he agreed, with half to be paid up front and the rest upon completion. Our discussion then moved to accessing the man's condo to gather more evidence. With the information I had on Stephen, Joe used my laptop to check his recent purchases. The most notable items were 2 plane tickets to Las Vegas and a 5-night hotel booking, which led us to decide to break into his condo. Joe asked if I knew about an alarm system. I admitted I wasn't sure, so he agreed to check and let me know. He mentioned that if there was an alarm, he'd charge extra for handling it. I agreed, as long as he provided valid reasons. It looked like my wife was planning one last getaway with this man. I checked my tablet to confirm that the tracking devices on their cars were working, allowing me to monitor their locations in real time. Additionally, I reviewed the home security cameras, confirming that she'd packed a small carry-on bag for the trip. The day of their departure arrived, and I tracked their progress from my hotel room. I called Joe, and he arranged to meet later that afternoon. He hadn't found any visible alarm system, but emphasized caution. We met a few blocks from Stephen's condo and went over the plan for entering. Joe, using his skills learned in prison, was an expert at picking locks. Just after sunset, with the fading light providing cover, Joe brought his laptop and a messenger bag, while I had my camera. When we reached Stephen's front door, Joe knelt down and quickly began working on the locks. After a minute, the door opened, and we entered, checking for signs of an alarm system. Finding none, we continued to Stephen's computer, which was conveniently accessible, allowing Joe to get to work. Before he started, I said, "Wait," and took a slow video of the room's layout, wanting to ensure we left everything as we found it. Joe nodded, agreeing it was essential not to leave traces. He resumed his task while I looked around for incriminating evidence. Scanning his mail, I found bank statements and credit card bills, then moved to the bedroom, recording the high-end decor and furniture, which suggested he was well off, though I still wasn't sure what he did for a living. Joe's excited call, "Paid dirt," pulled me back to the living room. He had successfully accessed Stephen's online bills, finding extra credit cards and checked details. Fortunately, I'd brought a card reader to store data from the magnetic strips. Joe suggested we use these for online purchases, potentially maxing out the cards in a few hours. He grinned, asking if we could empty his bank account. I confirmed we could, planning to initiate the transfer from Stephen's own computer to make it look legitimate. Joe noted that the bank might call to verify the transaction, but explained that no password would be needed since I had his social security number from the wallet. I chuckled at Stephen's lack of caution and gave Joe the go-ahead, stating that I wanted to inflict as much damage as possible. We decided to drain the account immediately and disable his credit cards on the day he returned from Vegas. Joe agreed enthusiastically, calling it the perfect homecoming gift. He stressed the need to cover our tracks carefully to avoid any backlash. I assured him we were taking precautions to stay undetected, noting our use of latex gloves as proof of our caution. Returning to the bedroom to search, I didn't find much until I checked the back of his closet, where I discovered a shoebox containing several recordable DVR discs, labeled with various women's names. As I emptied the box onto the bed to go through them, I didn't recognize any names until I saw Jamie that Fool had recorded them together, but why? Joe called me over from the other room, eager to show me something he had uncovered. He explained that the man we were targeting was engaged in blackmail, possessing numerous videos of different women with Stephen. The videos displayed the women's faces clearly, but Stephen's face was often hidden due to the angles. Joe found emails suggesting that the women were being blackmailed for money, with threats of using the footage in court. Joe speculated that Stephen preyed on married women with families, exploiting their vulnerabilities for his own gain. Seeking revenge, I asked Joe if Stephen had stored all the videos on his computer's hard drive. Joe replied that he wasn't sure but guessed that the DVDs in the closet might be the only copies. I decided to gather the DVDs and search for a backup drive, but I couldn't locate one. Returning to Joe, I learned he had found the backup drive. I told Joe to make a full backup and then erase the laptop's drive. I also shared my plan to destroy Stephen's blackmail scheme to financially ruin him. I wanted to notify the women involved that they were no longer at risk, so I asked Joe to print all relevant emails so I could set up an email account to reach them. Joe suggested setting up the account from Stephen's computer, and I agreed. Before we left, I did one last sweep of the place, and then we locked up and left. Back at the cars, I handed Joe an envelope with the rest of his payment and thanked him for his help. We shook hands, and he assured me he'd be ready for the next stage whenever needed. With that, he drove off, and I returned to my hotel to continue putting my plan into action. I called my in-laws to check on my daughters. My father-in-law answered, and I cheerfully greeted him, asking about the kids and hoping they weren't causing trouble. He reassured me that they were behaving well and mentioned Jamie's weekend trip with friends. I pretended not to know, saying I hadn't spoken to her yet and wanted to make sure the girls were okay before reaching out to her. This conversation made it clear that Jamie's father was unaware of her affair in Las Vegas, which deepened my disdain for her actions. My next call was to the house, knowing she wouldn't be there, so I left a message. After waiting an hour with no call back, I called her cell again. When she didn't answer, I left a message saying I was worried since I'd called the house with no response and was now calling her cell. I added that if I didn't hear back within an hour, I would call her parents. 15 minutes later, Jamie called me, sounding surprised, and asked if everything was all right, mentioning that she'd tried calling the house but got no answer. I assured her everything was fine and told her I had taken the girls to my parents' house after spending time with friends. Jamie's response sounded a bit tense. I suggested a night out together when I got back, but she seemed hesitant. Growing suspicious, I teased her, trying to make her nervous, but she said she was tired and hinted she wanted to end the call. Respecting her wishes, I said goodnight and expressed my love before hanging up. Despite my efforts to remain calm, anger simmered within me, and I struggled to sleep. Rising early, I went for my morning run, then returned to the hotel for a long shower. Afterward, I called the office to check if anything needed my attention, but everything was in order. Then I received the call every parent fears Rebecca had been injured at school and taken to the hospital. In that instant, nothing mattered more than my daughter's safety. The school had first called our house, and when no one answered, they tried me at work, leading someone from the office to notify me. I immediately called the school, and they informed me she'd broken her arm and was at the emergency room. I rushed out and headed straight to the hospital. Once there, I called Jamie's cell and left an angry message demanding that she call me within 15 minutes, or my next call would be to a divorce lawyer. An hour later, Jamie finally called me. I declined her call, focusing on comforting Rebecca as the doctors set her broken arm in a cast. My daughter was crying, asking for her mother, and I struggled with how to respond. Eventually, I managed to soothe her, and afterward I took her to her grandparents' home. My phone continued to ring, but I ignored the calls. Once I calmed down, I reached out to a reputable divorce lawyer and scheduled an appointment for the following day. When Jamie called again, I answered. She greeted me with sarcasm, commenting on my supposed luck at the blackjack tables. Tearfully, she then informed me she had contacted a divorce lawyer and threatened to use a video of me and Stephen as evidence to seek full custody of our children. I reminded her of her absence while our daughter was in the hospital, crying for her mother, who was instead with her lover in Las Vegas. Trying to sound reasonable, I suggested that she could begin a new life with Stephen and even consider having more children. She claimed that she truly loved and wanted to be with me, but feeling torn, I ended the call, unable to handle the emotional strain. I took Rebecca and Amy home, helped them pack some clothes, and brought them to my hotel, arranging for them to have their own room adjacent to mine. I then called Jamie's father to inform him of what had happened at school and that, for now, we would not be staying at the house until certain issues were settled. Later, my father-in-law called back, asking about the situation between Jamie and me. I explained that we were facing some challenges but encouraged him to speak with Jamie directly for more information. He assured me he would look after the girls temporarily, ensuring their safety and well-being, even though he didn't fully understand the situation. He wished us the best and expressed hope that we would find a resolution. After that, I contacted my lawyer, instructing him to begin the process of serving my wife. Next, I reached out to Mark, instructing him to cause financial damage to Stephen by maxing out his credit cards, emptying his accounts, and destroying his credit. That evening, Jamie called me in a distressed state. I hesitated to answer but eventually did after receiving a text from her, Tearfully, she confessed that Stephen was blackmailing her, threatening to release videos of them from their time in Vegas. I responded coldly, telling her she had brought this on herself through her choices, and I hung up, knowing she needed to face the consequences of her actions. She had chosen to abandon our marriage and family, and now she had to face the fallout. After making the final decision to end things with Jamie, I turned my attention to her lover, Stephen. I called Mark again, informing him that I'd arranged for my lawyer to serve Jamie with divorce papers within a few days. In the meantime, I wanted to protect my finances by moving funds offshore. Mark questioned my choice, but I assured him I was done with Jamie and determined to ensure she faced the repercussions. Mark mentioned a change of plans and proposed meeting at 5. We met at a dive bar and talked for nearly 2 hours before parting ways. We shook hands, and I handed him a generous envelope. For the next 3 days, Jamie kept calling, but I ignored her, wanting her to feel the sting of her choices. Finally, on Friday evening, I received the call I'd been waiting for, a video call. I answered and saw a man, bound to a chair and bloodied. A voice in the background informed Stephen that his friend had a message for him. Addressing Stephen directly, the speaker mentioned his recent trip to Tijuana and the exhaustion that must come with it. The speaker made veiled references to Stephen's financial troubles, suggesting that his current predicament might help him hide from the bank. The voice continued, referencing a man named Santiago and his special stew, hinting at something dark. They noted they could have pursued legal charges against Stephen for alienation of affection but chose not to waste their time. The message ended with a final farewell mentioning that Mr. Lopez was now involved. That was the last time I saw Stephen, and the look of fear in his eyes showed me it was a worthwhile investment. Stephen was alive when he was lowered into a large blue drum containing Santiago's special mix. After that, he vanished entirely, with no one ever asking about him. 7 months later, I was finally free. I gained custody of my daughters, retained the house until they were grown, after which we could sell and split the proceeds. There was no alimony or child support. I wanted nothing more to do with Jamie, though she retained visitation rights. Usually I dropped the girls at her place and leave. A year later, I began dating Lisa, who had previously been Amy's teacher, and Amy seems to prefer her company over her mother's. I haven't yet decided on marriage and am taking things slow.